Let's talk about past tense in German. And in this video, I'll cover everything you need to know to master level A1. So let's go to the overview first. You have the perfect tense, that is the present perfect. And we also need to talk about the Präteritum, the simple past. But for the Präteritum, you only need to know two verbs, sein, to be, and haben, to have. And every other verb you only need to know in the perfect tense. And so let's look at the perfect tense first. And a good way to start with learning any new tense in German is by starting with a fully regular verb that follows the standard conjugation patterns. And the one that I always like to use is machen. That means to do. And so the way we now get the perfect tense of machen is that we start by conjugating it in the present tense. So we start with ich mache, du machst, er macht, and there we stop. Now we have macht, the third person singular. And now we only need to add two letters in the beginning, which are ge. So we get gemacht. And gemacht, that is what we call the past participle in English, or in German we call this the Partizip 2, gemacht. And so this is the past form that we need. And we also add an auxiliary verb, which in this case is haben. And so the sentence will be, hat gemacht. He has done, or how we would say in English more naturally, he did. And so we can now conjugate this perfect tense by saying, ich habe gemacht, du hast gemacht, hat gemacht. And you can tell that only the auxiliary verb haben actually changes its form. The Partizip 2, gemacht, it stays constant and it doesn't change anything about the ending anymore. And so we can continue. Wir haben gemacht, ihr habt gemacht, and sie haben gemacht. And that is true for every verb in the perfect tense. The Partizip 2 doesn't change. And so we'll not repeat that for every verb, but just know that this is the pattern we always follow. And now let's look at a few more fully regular verbs that conjugate the same way in the perfect tense. So we have here kaufen, that means to buy. In the third person singular present tense, that is kauft. And then the perfect is hat gekauft. Hören means to hear or to listen becomes hört and hat gehört. Arbeiten, to work, arbeitet, hat gearbeitet. And lernen, to learn or to study, becomes lernt and then hat gelernt. All right, but as always, as it is with German, we also have irregular verbs. And these follow somewhat of a different pattern. Let's start with lesen, that's to read. Here you already in the present tense see that the third person singular is irregular. Lesen becomes liest. And now when we want to form the Partizip 2, that actually becomes gelesen. And you see that instead of the T ending, we now have an en ending. And that's actually very similar to English irregular verbs, if you think about it. So for example, in English, to do is an irregular verb, and the past participle will be done. Or go is an irregular verb, and the past participle is gone. So in English, it's a bit more random how the verb endings are, but in German, the past partizip is always, or the Partizip 2 ending is always en or T, always one of these two endings. So let's look at a second irregular example, that is treffen, to meet. And here the third person singular present tense is trifft. And then the perfect tense is hat getroffen. Here you see even more clearly the vowel change. Becomes O instead of lesen, where just remains in some sense. And then there are even exceptions of the exception. And one of them is, for example, denken, that is to think. And so here we have an irregular verb, but the Partizip 2 still forms with a T. So we'll say, hat gedacht. And that, I'm going a bit down a rabbit hole here, but this has something to do with language evolution, because a lot of these vowel changes, they come from very old ancestor languages of German from 5,000 and more years ago. So these are so-called Indo-European languages, and they already use these vowel changes to build different forms of the verbs. But in the case of verbs like denken, the vowel shift was introduced roughly 2,000 years ago. So it's a much younger kind of development. And the T is there because this verb used to be regular at some point, but as the language evolved, it became irregular. But the T still stayed there. And so that's kind of the quirk of language evolution, that irregular things come in. And actually, these developments happened when German and English were still the same language. Or another way to think about it is that they have the same ancestor language where this change happened. And so the equivalent word for denken in English is to think. And there as well, you see that the past participle is thought. And in English too, it's very unusual to have an irregular past form that ends with a T. So you see it's exactly equivalent between German and English in this case. And there's just a group of verbs that are irregular and that end with a T, and you just need to memorize them. All right, and so these are irregular verbs. But next, let's look at another thing that you also need to know in German, and that is that not all verbs conjugate with haben as the auxiliary verb, but some also conjugate with sein, to be. So let's briefly review. We had, for example, machen, macht, hat gemacht. Lesen, to read. Lesen, liest, hat gelesen. So these conjugate with haben. Now let's look at the example gehen. That means to go. This is an irregular verb. So in the present tense, third person singular, first it becomes geht. And then the past form is ist gegangen. Not hat gegangen, but ist gegangen. Gegangen, that is just irregular. There is no pattern here. You just need to memorize it. But why is it ist? That is because gehen is related to movement. And every verb that has something to do with movement, that brings you from one place to the other, that is conjugated with sein. So the same is true for our next example, fahren. That means to drive. Fahren becomes fährt, and then ist gefahren. Kommen, to come. Kommt. Ist gekommen. Fliegen, to fly. Fliegt. Ist geflogen. And so you see most of these verbs with sein, or at least a lot of them, they are irregular verbs. They conjugate with en and an irregular verb stem, but not all of them. So for example, we have reisen, to travel. That's regular. So it is reist and ist gereist. So you see, these are different dimensions. Verbs can conjugate with sein or with haben, and they can be regular or irregular. And either combination is possible. Any combination of these two is possible. They are not really related. All right. And so these are the most important rules that you need to know to build the perfect. Let's briefly talk about how we now build sentences, because that's a bit different from English. So let's look at the first example sentence here. Lisa hat Kaffee gemacht. Lisa has made coffee. Or more natural, you could say Lisa made coffee. And as I mentioned, there is the auxiliary verb haben or sein, and then the lexical verb. In German, we call it the Vollverb, that is gemacht, that goes to the end of the sentence. And that is different from English. So in English, you see the sentence is Lisa has made coffee. So the coffee is in the end, but in German, gemacht is in the end. And that's just the rule that every other part of the verb that is not the conjugated verb goes to the end. This is the same as you probably have learned before with separable verbs. So for example, einkaufen, to buy. in the present tense is ich kaufe ein, and the ein goes to the very end of the sentence. That is the same with the Partizip 2 here. And if we have a longer sentence, for example, Lisa made special black coffee today. In that case, still everything, all this information, the black special coffee today, goes before the verb. Lisa hat heute schwarzen speziellen Kaffee gemacht. So this needs a bit of a gear switch in your head, that you just know that this part of the verb goes to the end. And then another example, ich bin spazieren gegangen. I went for a walk. And if we ask a question, the verb isn't in position 2, but in position 1. Hast du Deutsch gelernt? Did you study German? Or bist du pünktlich gekommen? Did you come punctually? And so this is how you use the Partizip 2 and also the perfect tense in general in sentences. And now let's look at a few more groups that are a bit different from the standard rules we learned before. The first group we look at is separable verbs, like einkaufen that I just mentioned before. So here, if we use the third person singular present tense conjugation, we'll get kauft ein. And here the past or the Partizip 2 then is eingekauft. So the ge is there, but it doesn't go to the very beginning of the verb, but instead it goes between ein and kauft. So after the prefix, we get eingekauft. And in this case, we see it's a regular verb, but with the prefix, it looks like this. Let's look at a few more examples. Aufräumen, to clean up. In the present tense, räumt auf, but in perfect, it is hat aufgeräumt. Anrufen, to call someone. Present tense, ruft an. Perfect, hat angerufen. This is an example of an irregular verb. Even though you don't necessarily see it from this conjugation, it has a en ending, so it's irregular. And then aufstehen, to stand up. You see, standing up has something to do with movement, so that's why it is conjugated with sein. And then in present tense first, it is steht auf, and in perfect, ist aufgestanden. All right, that's how you do it with prefixes that are separable, but not all prefixes are separable. For example, we have verkaufen. This in the present tense conjugates as verkauft, not kauft ver, but verkauft. And by the way, if you're wondering how to tell whether a prefix is separable or not, the best way to learn this is that you just memorize the list of prefixes that are always separable. And there is also a list of prefixes that are never separable. For example, ein, this prefix is always separable, and ver, this one is never separable. You can find the list on the internet, or you can ask ChatGPT or any other AI, and you'll easily get this kind of list that shows you all the separable and non-separable prefixes. And so the way we now build the perfect tense with non-separable prefix verbs is that we basically just do the same as we do with all other verbs, but we don't add ge. So in the case of verkaufen, we get hat verkauft. And you need to be careful here because this looks exactly the same as the present tense actually. You see, verkauft and hat verkauft. This is not a mistake. The only difference here between present and perfect tense is the auxiliary verb. And that's how it is with all of these non-separable prefix verbs. So let's look at some more examples. Bekommen, that means to receive. Bekommt, hat bekommen. And by the way, notice that not always does it need to be exactly the same as the present tense because bekommen is irregular. So it gets the en ending. And so this is then the same actually as the infinitive form, but not as the third person present tense. And then we have empfehlen, to recommend. Empfiehlt, and in perfect tense, hat empfohlen. And begegnen, to encounter. Begegnet, and ist begegnet. All right. And then there is one more important group that we want to look at, and that is verbs that end with ieren. For example, diskutieren, to discuss. Diskutiert, that's the present tense, third person singular. And in the perfect, it is hat diskutiert. So you see, same as the non-separable verbs, these also don't get the ge in the beginning. And one way to think about it is that because of the ieren, these verbs already tend to be rather long, and then they don't, like German speakers don't want to make them even longer by also adding a ge in the beginning. And again, talking about language history, these verbs, they all came only a few hundred years ago, and they came from French. And actually, they also didn't only come to German, but they also went to English. So a lot of these ieren verbs have equivalents in English. For example, diskutieren is discuss, or studieren is to study, telefonieren is to telephone. And the only difference is that German sort of imported these verbs always with this ieren ending, so they are more clearly marked as these French import verbs. And so studieren, for example, that is to study or to learn. Studiert, then becomes hat studiert. Telefonieren, telefoniert, hat telefoniert. And then there is one exception, that is verlieren, to lose. And this just has the same ieren ending by coincidence, but actually it's a much older Germanic verb, and that means to lose. It's actually related to the English word forlorn, but that means more like lonely. In German, it has simply the meaning of lost. And so you can say verliert and hat verloren. And even though this is not a verb that ends with ieren as the other French verbs, it has the prefix ver, and that is a non-separable prefix, so it also doesn't get the ge, and in the end looks like it also belongs into this group, but it is irregular. Okay, and then let's look at the last perfect words, which we actually don't use a lot in perfect, but you need to know them. That is haben and sein. And so haben in perfect is hat gehabt, and sein is ist gewesen. And so the reason we don't like to use them a lot is because the forms are lengthy, and you have the auxiliary verb and the lexical verb, or in German we would say the Hilfsverb and the Vollverb. They are twice the same verb, just in different conjugated forms, and that doesn't look very elegant. So he has had, or like in the English translation it is he has been, but in German it is literally he is been. And so this verb repetition is not very elegant, and that's why we mostly use the Präteritum, and that's exactly what we'll look at next. This is the simple past in English, and you only need to know it for the verbs sein and haben for the A1 level. And the simple past is actually a conjugated form. So, for example, I was in German is ich war, and then you were is du warst, and it continues with war, wir waren, ihr wart, sie waren. And this time the way you build sentences is exactly the same as you do with the present tense, just you use the past tense conjugation. This is now again the same as English, and because you don't have any auxiliary verb, there is also nothing you need to move to the end of the sentence. These just stay in position 2 in normal sentences. So this is sein, to be. And now let's also look at haben, to have. Here I can say, ich hatte, du hattest, hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. And this is called the Präteritum tense. All right, and this was everything you need to know to build the past tense in German for level A1. If you have any questions, please let me know down below in the comments, and I'll be happy to answer. And otherwise, I hope I'll see you in the next one. Tschüss!